She stood at the foot of the grand staircase in Blackwood Hall, her hands clasped tightly before her, and felt the weight of 100 whispers pressing against her skin. The great chandelier above spilled warm golden light across the marble floor, but none of its warmth reached Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Thornwood. Her husband, Alexander, the Duke of Thornwood, had just walked past her to greet Lady Margaret Pemberton, taking her gloved hand with a reverence he had never once shown his own wife. He did not even glance in Eleanor's direction. The silence between them was so complete, so practiced, that the guests in the hall seemed to hold their breath, exchanging knowing looks that cut deeper than any spoken insult. Eleanor stood perfectly still, a portrait of composure, while inside she felt the last fragile thread of hope snap cleanly in two. The evening had been intended as a celebration. Alexander had successfully negotiated a trade agreement that would bring prosperity to the entire county, and the local gentry had gathered to honor him. Eleanor had worn a new gown of deep sapphire silk, chosen because his valet had once mentioned the Duke favored that color. She had rehearsed a few light, intelligent remarks about the trade routes, hoping to catch his interest at dinner. But when she descended the staircase, Alexander's cool gray eyes had swept over her without a flicker of recognition, and he had turned immediately to escort Lady Margaret into the dining room, leaving Eleanor to follow alone, her cheeks burning. Throughout the meal, she sat at the far end of the long table, a place that might as well have been in another room. She could hear the low murmur of his voice, see the slight inclination of his head as Lady Margaret leaned closer, her laughter rippling like water over stones. The soup course arrived, then the fish, and Eleanor did not taste a single bite. Beside her, an elderly baron made gentle conversation about the weather, and she answered with the grace expected of her station, but her mind kept circling back to a single, devastating realization. She had been married to Alexander for 2 years, and in all that time, he had never once looked at her the way he was now looking at Lady Margaret. Not once. The wedding had been arranged by her father, a baron with more pride than fortune, who had amassed a crippling debt to the Thornwood estate. Alexander had agreed to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for her hand, a transaction that had spared her family from ruin, but had made her feel more like a piece of collateral than a bride. On their wedding night, Alexander had come to her chamber, stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back, and delivered the terms of their union with the precision of a legal contract. Their marriage would secure the alliance, provide heirs if nature permitted, and require nothing more. He would respect her, he said, but she should expect no affection. He had uttered the words without cruelty, but also without any hint of warmth. Eleanor, then only 19, had nodded silently, her heart folding inward like a flower at dusk. The first year she had tried. She had tried with an earnest, aching sincerity that now seemed almost embarrassing to remember. She learned his favorite dishes and instructed the cook to prepare them. She arranged fresh flowers in his study, choosing white roses because his late grandmother had planted the rose garden. She sat in the library in the evenings, hoping he might wander in and share the quiet with her. Sometimes he did, but he would select a book and settle into a chair by the fire, his face half hidden by shadow, and never speak. She could feel the distance between them as a physical presence, a cold current that no amount of effort could cross. Once on the anniversary of their first year together, she had placed a small, carefully wrapped gift on his desk. It was a leather-bound journal, embossed with his initials, because she had noticed his old one was nearly full. He had opened it, regarded it with that unreadable expression, and said only, "Thank you, Eleanor." Then he had set it aside and returned to his correspondence. She had stood there for a moment, hope dissolving like sugar in rain, before retreating to her room where she had wept into her pillow so the servants would not hear. A second year had passed since that gift, and now she stood alone in the great hall as the last guests departed, watching Alexander bid Lady Margaret farewell with a softness around his mouth that made Eleanor's chest ache. When the heavy doors finally closed and the servants began extinguishing the candles, he walked past her toward his study without a word. She followed him, her slippers silent on the marble, and paused in the doorway. He was already seated behind his desk, a stack of papers before him, his cravat loosened just slightly, a sign of fatigue she had learned to recognize. For a moment, she saw not the formidable Duke but a man carrying invisible burdens, and the sight sparked a foolish, stubborn flicker of sympathy. "Alexander," she said softly. He did not look up. "It is late, Eleanor, you should rest." "I wish to say, the evening was a success. Everyone spoke highly of your achievement." He dipped his pen into the inkwell. "As expected, good night." The dismissal was clean, impersonal, final. Eleanor felt the words like a door closing inches from her face. She turned and climbed the stairs to her cold, beautiful chamber, where a single candle burned on the mantel. That night she did not cry. Instead, she sat at the window, looking out at the dark expanse of the estate grounds, and allowed a new, unfamiliar resolve to settle into her bones. She could not keep bleeding for a man who would never see the wound. Something had to change. But she was not yet ready to admit that the change needed to come from within her, not from him. The weeks that followed unfolded in muted shades of gray. Autumn crept over Blackwood Hall, stripping the trees and frosting the lawns, and Eleanor retreated into a quiet routine of solitary walks and neglected needlework. The hope that had once propelled her through each day now felt like a language she was forgetting. She no longer waited for Alexander to notice the new silk cushions she had arranged in the morning room. She stopped requesting that the kitchen prepare his favorite roast on Thursdays. When he failed to appear at breakfast, she ate alone without glancing at the doorway. The household staff, ever observant, began to treat her with a careful, pitying gentleness that she found almost harder to bear than open disregard. One afternoon, a letter arrived that shifted something deep within her. It was from Mrs. Harriet Finch, a widow in the village who ran a small foundling hospital on the edge of Thornwood land. Eleanor had visited the hospital once, months ago, on a charitable tour arranged by the parish vicar. She had held a tiny baby girl with wisps of red hair and had felt a fierce, protective love surge through her, a love that asked nothing in return. Mrs. Finch's letter was a simple plea. The hospital roof had begun to leak, the winter was approaching, and the children were at risk of fever. The parish funds were exhausted. Could her grace offer any assistance at all? Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her heart quickening. Here was a need she could meet, a purpose that required no one's approval. She had a small personal allowance, stipulated in her marriage contract, and she had barely touched it. Within the hour she had ordered the carriage and was rattling down the lane toward the village, a sense of quiet urgency propelling her forward. She did not inform Alexander. She doubted he would notice her absence, and she no longer wished to invite his indifference. The Foundling Hospital was a modest stone building with a crumbling chimney and a door that stuck in its frame. Inside, the air smelled of lye soap and milk, and the sound of children's voices echoed from the upper floor. Mrs. Finch, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, greeted Eleanor with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. Her grace had come herself, without attendants, without ceremony. Eleanor simply rolled up the sleeves of her traveling dress and asked to see the damage. She spent the entire afternoon there, climbing a rickety ladder to inspect the roof, counting blankets and coal reserves, and holding one coughing infant after another. The children, ranging from newborns to toddlers, regarded her with wide, wary eyes. One little boy, perhaps 3 years old, tugged at her skirt and whispered, "Are you a queen?" Eleanor knelt and cupped his cheek, her throat tight. "No, sweetheart, I'm only a friend." It was the truest thing she had said about herself in years. She returned to Blackwood Hall after dusk, dusty and exhausted, but with a lightness in her chest that she could not remember feeling before. For the first time, the grand house did not feel like a gilded cage but simply a place where she would sleep before returning to something that mattered. She made no mention of her outing at dinner, and Alexander, as expected, did not inquire. Her visits to the Foundling Hospital became a secret rhythm, the heartbeat of her days. She brought food, arranged for a carpenter to mend the roof, and sat for hours rocking fretful bobbies, while Mrs. Finch managed the accounts. Eleanor discovered that she had a talent for soothing colicky infants, and a patience she had never needed to cultivate in the drawing rooms of the ton. The children began to recognize her step on the threshold and would scramble toward her, sticky hands outstretched. She learned their names: Thomas, the boy who had called her a queen; little red-haired Susanna, who refused to sleep unless Eleanor sang; baby James, whose mother had died of fever and who now smiled whenever Eleanor entered the room. In those quiet, unguarded moments, she stopped being the invisible Duchess and became simply Eleanor. The transformation was so gradual, so gentle, that she did not notice the grief inside her beginning to loosen its grip. She still shared a roof with a man who barely acknowledged her existence, but the sting of his rejection grew fainter, replaced by the steady warmth of new purpose. Sometimes, rocking a child in the dim light of the nursery, she would allow herself to imagine a different life, one where she was valued not for her title but for the love she could give. And in those imaginings, Alexander's face would appear, and she would feel a pang of longing so acute it stole her breath. The heart, she was learning, does not relinquish its hopes easily, even when the mind has accepted defeat. Her quiet transformation did not go entirely unnoticed by the household. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reeves, observed that the Duchess seemed more serene, less prone to wander the halls like a restless ghost. The footmen whispered that her Grace had taken up charity work and returned each evening with a soft, distant smile. But the one person who should have noticed remained oblivious. Until the evening the fever broke. It happened in mid-November, when a chill rain hammered against the windows of Blackwood Hall and the wind moaned through the chimneys. Eleanor had spent the day at the hospital, where 3 children had fallen ill with a respiratory infection that crackled in their tiny chests. She had stayed until nightfall, helping Mrs. Finch prepare steam tents and poultices, and had returned home drenched to the bone, shivering violently. By morning, her own throat burned, and her limbs ached with a fever that left her sheets soaked. The Duke was informed by his valet, who had been told by the housekeeper, that her Grace was unwell. Alexander received the news in his study, pen suspended above a ledger, and for a long moment he did not move. A peculiar sensation, half irritation and half something far more disquieting, twisted in his stomach. He had grown accustomed to Eleanor's unobtrusive presence, the faint sound of her footsteps in the hall, the occasional glimpse of her quiet figure in the garden. Her illness disrupted a pattern he had taken for granted, and that disruption unsettled him more than he expected. He did not go to her chamber. Instead, he found himself standing in the upstairs corridor late that evening, long after the doctor had left. Her door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of candlelight fell across the floor. He could hear her labored breathing, the occasional soft moan of someone trapped in feverish dreams. His hand lifted almost of its own accord toward the door handle, but he stopped himself. What would he say? What comfort could he offer? He had no language for tenderness. It had been stripped from him long ago, buried beneath duty and loss. So he stood in the shadows, listening to her breathe, his jaw clenched tight, until the candle guttered and the room fell silent. Then he retreated to his study and did not sleep at all. The fever passed after 3 days, and Eleanor emerged pale and thin, with new hollows beneath her eyes but a clear, steady light within them. She was changed in some fundamental way, as if the illness had burned away the last of her desperate yearning. When she finally came downstairs, wrapped in a heavy shawl, she passed Alexander in the hallway without her usual tentative pause. She merely inclined her head and continued toward the morning room, where a pot of tea awaited her. Alexander watched her go, and a strange, discomfiting emptiness yawned open in his chest. He told himself it was relief that she had recovered. He was lying. The incident at the Harvest Festival unfolded a fortnight later, a moment that would lodge in Alexander's memory like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore. The village celebrated the end of the season with stalls and music on the green, and as Duke and Duchess, their attendance was expected. Eleanor went willingly, because the foundling children would be there, wrapped in new coats she had commissioned. She drifted among them like a sunbeam, kneeling to tie a bonnet, laughing at their clumsy dancing, entirely unaware of the picture she made. A young physician from a neighboring parish, Dr. Henry Carlisle, had volunteered his services at the hospital and had quickly become a friendly, unassuming presence in Eleanor's new world. He was not handsome in the polished manner of London gentlemen, but his face held a steady kindness, and his hands were gentle when he examined a sick child. At the festival, he walked beside Eleanor, carrying a toddler on his shoulders, and the two of them talked with the ease of colleagues who shared a deep affection for their work. Alexander, standing with the local magistrate beneath the old oak tree, saw them. He saw the way Dr. Carlisle leaned down to listen to something Eleanor said, the way she tilted her head back to smile at him, a smile she had never once directed at her husband. Something hot and tight coiled in Alexander's gut, an emotion he refused to name. He watched as the doctor helped Eleanor lift a small girl onto a pony ride, his hand briefly covering hers on the reins. The image seared into Alexander's mind with uncomfortable clarity. He had given Eleanor nothing but distance, and yet some foolish part of him bristled at the sight of another man offering her ordinary human warmth. He approached them with deliberate strides, his face arranged into its usual mask of cool authority. "Dr. Carlisle," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made even the children fall silent, "I was not aware your duties extended to escorting my wife." Henry Carlisle met his gaze without flinching. "Her Grace has been a tireless supporter of the hospital, Your Grace. I merely wish to express my gratitude." Eleanor turned to Alexander, and for the first time there was no anxiety in her expression, no desperate search for his approval. There was only a calm, distant politeness. "Dr. Carlisle has been an invaluable help with the children, Alexander. The hospital is fortunate to have him." She spoke as if addressing a respected but uninvolved acquaintance, and the shift unsettled Alexander more than he would ever admit. He did not make a scene. He could not, under the bright autumn sky with half the village watching, but he remained at Eleanor's side for the remainder of the festival, a silent, brooding shadow, and Dr. Carlisle, ever perceptive, gradually melted back into the crowd. On the carriage ride home, the silence between husband and wife was so heavy that Eleanor could almost hear the unspoken words trembling on Alexander's lips. He said nothing, though his hands were clenched into fists on his knees. She did not ask what troubled him. The part of her that would have once been desperate to bridge that silence had withered, and in its place grew a quiet, resilient independence that both frightened and exhilarated her. The winter brought a fragile peace. Eleanor continued her work at the Foundling Hospital, now joined occasionally by a few other ladies from the parish who had been inspired by her example. She had become a figure of quiet admiration in the village, not as the Duke's wife, but as the gentle woman who sang to orphans and mended their clothes with her own hands. The household staff, too, began to treat her with a new deference that was no longer rooted in pity but in genuine respect. Only Alexander remained trapped in his fortress of silence, though now he found himself watching her from windows, listening for her step in the corridors, and remembering, with an ache he could not soothe, the way she had once looked at him with desperate, hopeful eyes. One evening, he found himself standing in the doorway of the morning room where she was sorting through a pile of donated baby clothes. She was humming under her breath, a lullaby he had not heard since his own childhood, and the sound struck him like a blow to the chest. She looked up, saw him there, and simply waited, her hands still among the small garments. "You have been spending a great deal of time in the village," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," she replied evenly. "The children need attention, and I find the work fulfilling. Your duties as Duchess should take precedence." She folded a tiny linen shirt with precise, unhurried movements. "I have not neglected my duties, Alexander. The household runs smoothly. Your social obligations are met. But I cannot spend my life waiting in a drawing room for something that will never come." The words were not angry. They were factual, delivered with the same quiet authority with which she now carried herself, and they cut him deeper than any accusation could have. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. What could he possibly say? That he had noticed her absence, that the house felt unbearably empty without the possibility of her presence, that he had stood outside her door when she was sick, frozen by his own inadequacy. He was the Duke of Thornwood, master of estates and fortunes, but in matters of the heart he was a pauper. So he simply turned and walked away, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on his shoulders. Spring arrived, and with it a discovery that would unravel the careful walls he had built around himself. Eleanor had been cataloging the hospital's ledgers in the small office Mrs. Finch had set aside for her, when she came across a bundle of receipts tied with a faded ribbon. They were donations, recorded over the past 2 years, made anonymously. The sums were significant, far beyond the means of any local benefactor. The handwriting on the accompanying notes was unmistakably Alexander's. She would have recognized that sharp, decisive script anywhere. The notes contained only the barest of phrases: for the children's fuel, for new beds, for the nurses' wages. No signature, no expectation of gratitude. She stared at the papers until the ink blurred before her eyes. All this time, the Duke had been silently funding the very hospital where she had found her purpose. He had not told her. He had not used it as leverage or proof of his hidden goodness. He had simply done it quietly, while maintaining his impenetrable distance from her. The contradiction was so baffling that she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Who was this man who could extend such kindness to strangers, yet withhold even a sliver of warmth from his own wife? She could not confront him immediately. The knowledge was too raw, too disorienting. Instead, she tucked the receipts back into the ledger and returned to Blackwood Hall, her mind a tempest. That evening, she sat across from him at dinner in a silence that was no longer merely distant but charged with unspoken questions. He glanced at her more than once, his gray eyes sharpening as if he sensed the change in her, but he said nothing. Later, unable to sleep, she wandered into the library and found him there, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring into the fire. He did not seem surprised to see her. Perhaps some part of him had been waiting. "Alexander," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I found the donations you made to the hospital. All those months, even before I began my visits, you were helping them. Why did you never tell me?" His shoulders stiffened. For a long moment the only sound was the crackle of the logs. Then he spoke, and his voice was stripped of its usual commanding calm. "Because I did not want your gratitude." "Why?" She stepped closer, her heart hammering. "Why would you hide goodness that might have brought us closer?" He turned to face her, and the firelight carved deep lines of weariness and pain across his features. "Because I do not know how to be close, Eleanor. I was not taught. My parents' marriage was a battlefield of cold silences and bitter recriminations. My mother left when I was 7, and my father never spoke of her again except with contempt. I grew up believing that love was a weakness, that attachment led only to loss. When I married you, I promised myself I would not inflict that chaos on you. I would provide, protect, and keep my distance. I thought I was being merciful." Eleanor's eyes stung. "Merciful? You left me alone in a house full of echoes. I ached for a single kind word, a single glance that meant something. I thought I was invisible to you." "You were never invisible." His voice cracked, and the sound of it broke something open inside her. "I saw everything. I saw the journal you placed on my desk, and I could not bring myself to thank you properly because to do so would have meant admitting how much it meant to me. I saw you descend the staircase in your sapphire gown, and I had to look away because if I had let myself truly see you, I would have been undone. I am a coward, Eleanor. I have always been a coward when it comes to you." She was shaking now, not with anger but with a sorrow so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. 2 years, Alexander. 2 years I spent hoping you might let me in, and now you tell me it was fear, not indifference. He took a step toward her, his hands lifted slightly, as if he wanted to touch her but did not dare. "I deserve your resentment. I have watched you these past months, watched you grow into a woman who no longer needs me, who no longer even seems to want my presence. And the knowledge that I drove you to that point has been a torment I cannot describe. When I saw you with Dr. Carlyle at the festival, I felt something I have never allowed myself to feel: jealousy, raw and desperate. I realized that I had pushed you so far away that another man might step into the space I had abandoned, and the thought of it was unbearable. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. Henry is a friend, nothing more, but you are my husband. You could have been so much more if only you had spoken these words a year ago, 2 years ago. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. I have come to this truth too late. I have loved you, Eleanor, in my broken, silent way from the very beginning, and I have been so terrified of failing you that I failed you completely. A sob escaped her, and she pressed her fist against her lips to contain it. The firelight danced over them, two figures separated by years of silence, and now by the fragile, terrifying possibility of a new beginning. She thought of the children in the hospital, the way they reached for her without fear, trusting her to hold them. She thought of the receipts in the ledger, proof of a kindness he had hidden even from himself. And she thought of the lonely man standing before her, who had been taught that love was a wound and had spent a lifetime avoiding it, only to find himself bleeding anyway. She closed the distance between them and took his hands. They were cold and they trembled slightly against her palms. "You are not too late," she said, her voice thick with tears. "But I will not go back to the way things were. I cannot return to that silent, hungry girl. If we are to try, it must be with honesty. No more masks, no more retreat." He looked down at their joined hands as if they were some miraculous thing he did not deserve. "I do not know if I can learn to be the husband you need, but I want to try, Eleanor. I want to try with everything I have." She lifted one of his hands and pressed it gently to her cheek. The gesture was so simple, so human, that a shudder ran through him. "Then we will learn together," she said, slowly, imperfectly, but together. The confession did not heal them overnight. The wounds were too deep, the habits too ingrained. There were days when Alexander retreated into his study, overwhelmed by the vulnerability that now lay exposed between them, and Eleanor would feel the old fear creeping back into her heart. But there were also mornings when he would find her in the morning room and simply sit beside her, not speaking, but present. He began to accompany her to the hospital, standing a little awkwardly among the clamoring children, until one day a toddler tugged at his immaculate cravat and called him Papa Duke. And Eleanor saw his stern face break into a smile so unguarded and bright that she had to turn away to hide her own joy. Dr. Carlyle, ever the gentleman, had quietly withdrawn his attentions upon sensing the shift between the Duke and Duchess. He remained a valuable friend to the hospital, but his visits became less frequent, and when he did appear, he treated Eleanor with the warm professionalism of a colleague, nothing more. Alexander, for his part, never spoke of him again, but Eleanor noticed that he made a point of being present whenever Dr. Carlyle called, a silent, protective shadow that she found more endearing than possessive. The true turning point came one evening in early summer, when Eleanor received a letter from her father's solicitor. The old baron had passed away peacefully in his sleep, and the letter detailed the final settlement of his affairs. Among the papers was a document that Eleanor had never seen before, a copy of the original marriage agreement, annotated in Alexander's own hand. In the margins, he had written instructions that went far beyond the mere forgiveness of her father's debt. He had quietly created a trust that would provide for her independently, ensuring that she would never want for anything even if the marriage ended. He had added a clause that gave her the right to claim a separate residence at any time, without question or opposition. He had given her freedom secretly, while she had believed herself bound to him by obligation. She confronted him in the garden, where the roses his grandmother had planted were in full bloom. The air was sweet with their fragrance, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold. She thrust the paper toward him, her hands unsteady. "You gave me an escape," she said, her voice raw. "From the very beginning you built a door for me. Why?" He looked at the document, then at her, and the last of his defenses crumbled. "Because I wanted you to choose me. Not because you were trapped, not because you had no other option. I wanted you to stay only if you wished it. And I was so certain you would not wish it, once you saw what a cold, barren life I could offer, that I never dared ask you to try." She let the paper fall to the grass and stepped into his arms. The embrace was clumsy at first, his hands uncertain on her back, her cheek pressed against the fine wool of his coat. But then he pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair, and she felt the tremor that ran through him, the silent, shaking release of years of solitude. They stood like that for a long time, the roses nodding around them, the sky deepening to indigo, two people who had finally, painfully, found their way home. "I choose you," she whispered against his chest. "I choose you, Alexander, not because I am bound, but because I see you now. The man who gives without seeking credit. The man who is terrified of love but loves anyway. The man who stood outside my door when I was ill because he did not know how to enter. I choose all of you." He could not speak. His throat was too tight, his heart too full. But he pressed his lips to her temple with a tenderness that said everything words could not, and Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the last of her old grief slip away into the perfumed evening air. The healing did not end with a single confession. It continued through the slow, steady work of daily life. Alexander began to unlearn the habits of a lifetime, letting his wife see his weariness, his doubts, his small triumphs. He learned to sit with her in the evenings and tell her about his day, not as a duke reporting to his duchess, but as a man sharing his world with the woman he loved. Eleanor, in turn, allowed herself to hope again, not with the desperate, clinging hope of her younger self, but with a quiet confidence rooted in the knowledge of her own worth. They began to build new traditions. Every Sunday, they visited the foundling hospital together, and Alexander, to everyone's astonishment, proved to have a gift for storytelling. The children would gather around him, wide-eyed, as he recounted tales of knights and dragons in a deep, rumbling voice. Eleanor would watch from the doorway, her heart swelling with a joy so profound it was almost painful. The cold duke had become the hero of nursery tales, and the transformation was so complete that sometimes she wondered if she had dreamed the years of silence. On the first anniversary of their confession in the library, Alexander took her back to that room, where a fire crackled in the hearth and a single white rose lay on the desk. He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a locket, delicate and old, containing a miniature portrait of his grandmother and a folded slip of paper. On the paper, in his sharp, distinctive script, were the words, "To Eleanor, who taught my grandson that love is not a weakness. With my deepest gratitude, from the woman who planted the roses." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandmother's locket." "She left it to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was supposed to give it to the woman I loved, but I hid it away because I believed I would never have the courage to use it. I was wrong. I have loved you longer than I have understood love, Eleanor. I hope you can forgive me for being so slow to speak it." She let him fasten the locket around her neck, the metal cool against her skin. Then she took his face in her hands and kissed him softly in the firelight, while the old house settled around them like a benediction. They did not live in perfect harmony after that, for no two people ever do. But they lived in truth, and that truth carried them through the years that followed. Eleanor's hospital grew, funded openly now by the Thornwood estate, and the village thrived under their joint stewardship. When their first child, a daughter with her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle smile, was born, Alexander wept without shame, cradling the tiny bundle as if she were made of spun glass. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, when the household was asleep and the roses rustled outside the window, Eleanor would look at her husband and remember the woman she had once been, the woman who stood alone at the foot of a staircase, aching for a love that seemed impossible. She would feel a pang of sorrow for that younger self, but also a fierce, protective gratitude. Because that woman, in her loneliness, had learned to stop seeking love from someone who could not give it, and in doing so, had found the strength to offer love herself. And that offering, free and unencumbered, had become the very thing that had finally, irrevocably, brought the Duke of Thornwood to his knees and to his heart. The story of Eleanor and Alexander was not one of grand gestures or sweeping rescues. It was a story of quiet courage, of choosing to remain tender in a house that had forgotten tenderness, of learning to speak after years of silence. It was, above all, a story of hope, the stubborn, luminous hope that even the coldest distance can be bridged, one honest word at a time. And in the end, when the final page of their long, complicated love story was written, it would say simply this: they found each other not despite the silence, but because they had the courage to break it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.